Morning, Journey. I've been excited for a while about this sermon series. Nehemiah is one of my favorite books in the Bible. Nehemiah is one of my favorite characters from history. In fact, my youngest son, Caleb, Nehemiah is his middle name. It's Caleb Nehemiah Ralston. And there's so much that is packed into this historical account of this man named Nehemiah. And actually, I've been a little bit ahead of where we're at here. I've been teaching through Nehemiah with our campus ministry up at USD this semester, and some of you that are here, some of the football guys, we have home football chapel here, every home game for Wayne State, and we've been walking through the book of Nehemiah, and we've been talking a lot as I've been walking through this book about Nehemiah being about this idea of what God wants to build in us so that he can build something through us. That this story, like Dave mentioned last week, it seems to be sometimes only about the wall that's being rebuilt around the city of God, but really it illustrates for us what God wants to build inside of us because he wants to build something through us. And I watched the sermon from last week. I was out of town, and I watched it during this week, and I loved how Dave set the table with the historical background that leads us into where we're at Nehemiah. And as we begin to dive into this idea of Nehemiah praying for 4 months before God moved, before Nehemiah did anything. And actually the sermon last week provoked a couple questions inside of me that I've been wrestling with this week as I prep for chapter 2. And I kind of want to start that way this morning with you. One of those questions that sermon last week kind of just raised up within me is, when is the last time that any of us prayed for 4 months about the same thing? And not only about the same thing, but when's the last time that any of us prayed for 4 months or longer for God to do something through us or in us? Not to do something for us, but to do something in us and through us. See, the amazing thing to me is that Nehemiah never asks God to rebuild the wall. Nehemiah asks God to give him an opportunity to go and build the wall. And it just got this question in me of like, when's the last time in my own life that I prayed for this extended amount of time for God not to give me something or to do something for me, but for God to do something in me or through me? And that kind of provoked a second question, which I think we're going to look at this morning in chapter 2. And that question became that if I prayed for 4 months or longer, and if I could spend that kind of time going before God, being burdened by the things of God and asking God to do something in me or through me, if God answered that prayer and opened that door, would I walk through it? That how many times do I want God to do something, and then God opens the door and says, hey, what I want to do, I want to do through you, now go. See, in chapter 2 this morning, we're going to see that Nehemiah has spent these 4 months praying. 4 months praying and fasting. And now in chapter 2, an opportunity arises where God answers his prayer, and Nehemiah has to decide, will he walk through the door? Will he seize this opportunity to be used by God to build, or more accurately, rebuild? And will he do what God calls him to do? He's been praying and asking for God to restore and renew his people, to restore and rebuild the city of God. And now God will open this door and say, hey, Nehemiah, the answer is here. You just have to walk through it. And the question becomes, will he do it? Will we walk through the door? Will we seize the moment when God answers our prayer for opportunity? So we're going to walk through chapter 2, kind of verse by verse this morning. And in the first 3 verses, this is what Nehemiah tells us. He says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, why is your face sad? You're not sick. This can be nothing but sadness of heart. Nehemiah says, then I was very much afraid. And I said to the king, let the king live forever. But why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? See, I think as we begin to answer this question, as we think about what does it mean to step through the door that God opens to answer the prayer that we've been praying, what does it mean for God to do something in us so we can do something through us, there's some questions that arise in this story as well. And the first one is this, are we really burdened for the things of God? And are we looking for opportunities to be the solution? Are you and I really burdened for the things that burden the heart of God? This whole thing that we're going to read today in this story arises because Nehemiah is so burdened. He is so bothered. He is so affected by what has happened to the city of God that it bleeds out of his everyday life. Like, it's so bothered Nehemiah that it changes the way he looks. It changes the way he acts. It changes the way he talks. It changes the countenance on his face. And there just comes a day where he goes before the king and he just can't hide it anymore. And we've been there, right? Like, there's been things in our life that so affect us and so bother us that you walk in and somebody goes, dude, something's wrong, right? Or, what's going on? And Nehemiah is so burdened by this that one day he comes before the king and he just can't hide it. And so then the king says, Nehemiah, what's wrong? And Nehemiah is so burdened, he is so bothered by this problem that he can't help but unload on the king. Now, to you and me, that doesn't seem like a big deal, right? Like when somebody says to us, hey, what's going on, what's wrong, and we unload, it's not a big deal. But in Nehemiah's day with the king, it's a big deal. Like when Nehemiah says, I was very much afraid, it's because of the king. See, in Nehemiah's day, you didn't go before the king looking sad or looking distraught or looking like something bothered you, because the king's first response or first initial thought would be, well, he's bothered by something about me. And then the king's second initial thought is, he's going to lead a revolt against me. And then the king's first response is, he will chop off your head. And so Nehemiah goes in, and when the king says, what's wrong, Nehemiah should be very afraid. Because normally the next response will be, take him away. But Nehemiah is so burdened that he can't not share. And Nehemiah unloads. And he says, King, why? I can't help but be sad. Oh, King, live forever. That's his way of saying, please don't kill me. But he says, King, why wouldn't I be sad? Why wouldn't I be distraught? Look what's happened to God's people. Look what happened to God's city. Look what's been done. King, I just have to go do something for this. He's so burdened that it changes everything about him. And church, I think that begs the question in us. When's the last time we were burdened by the things of God so much that it changed how we lived? Like burdened by the things that burden the heart of God, right? Like big things. Like not, overtime losses on Friday night, right? Although it stays with me and changes the way I live. But like, when is that, right? And don't miss this. Nehemiah is willing to change everything. Bible scholar Kent Hughes says this. He says, don't miss this about Nehemiah. Nehemiah left this beautiful, rich, wealthy kingdom where he had everything he wanted. And he will leave this for a dispirited community in a dilapidated city that he's never seen. And he did this because the grace of God had so captured his heart that he had this vision of what God wanted him to do about the situation that was before him. Nehemiah is so burdened that he's looking for God to open a door. And so God does. Verse 4, the king said to me, Nehemiah, what do you want? What are you requesting? Nehemiah has something in us so he can build something through us. We have to be willing to seize the moments when they arrive. We have to step into the opportunities when they happen. We have to walk through the door when it's opened. And Nehemiah has prayed and he has fasted and he has longed for this for 4 months. And yet we all know there's a giant difference between asking and doing, right? There's a giant difference between talking a big game and living a big game. And God opens this door, and it's literally Nehemiah's life. Like the king could just as easily say, are you kidding me? Get out of here. The king just as easily could have said, really, you want to go to a city away from here and rebuild a kingdom so you could take over for me? You're dead. But Nehemiah had prayed for God to provide an opportunity, even if maybe it wasn't the way that he thought it would look. And God opens this door and Nehemiah walks through because he believes that God will provide. And why shouldn't God provide that opportunity? Right? I've been doing this a long time, walking with Jesus a long time, doing ministry a long time. One of the things I've learned is that many, many times God opens the door once he knows we're going to walk through it. That sometimes you sit down and you pray and you have a plan for how you would do this if God showed up, and then God goes, here you go. Many, many times God waits to move until his people put their foot in the water first. But I've seen over and over and over again, when people decide that they will move when God opens the door, then God goes, well, I've just been waiting on you. I'll let you in on a secret journey. I won't go into the story because many of you have heard it and we don't have time. That's how you have a coffee shop in this town. Right? The table down the street, that's how that arrived. 2 people sat down and said, this would be cool if God would do this. God, if we could have a place for people to gather and community to be built, this is what we would do with it. So God, we're going to pray, and maybe in the next 10 years, if you provided that, we're going to be ready. And then God goes, oh, how about 10 minutes? Here you go. And I wonder how many times God has these moments and these opportunities, but he doesn't give them because we're not ready or we're not willing. He knows we're really not going to step into it. And why shouldn't he do it that way, right? Like, why should God constantly open doors for people who are never willing to walk through them? There's a big difference, right, between saying we'll do something and doing something. And in this moment, Nehemiah decides that what he has been saying, he will do. It's kind of like the old riddle that I'm sure many of you have heard, but we'll test you anyway. 5 frogs sitting on a log. 4 decide to jump in the water. How many frogs are left? You can answer. Anybody? Thank you. Yeah, look at that. She's my mom. That's how that works. All right. She's heard that story more than the rest of you probably, right? It's 5. There's still 5. Why? Because deciding isn't doing. 4 frogs can decide to jump in, but maybe they didn't actually do it. See, Nehemiah is in constant communication with God, especially about this burden. And he is cupbearer to the king. Dave talked about this last week. He is a confidant probably of the king. He is pretty high up the food chain. And so Nehemiah decides to use his position and the people that God has put around him for the purpose that God has laid on his heart. And so, church, the question that you and I should at least think about this morning is how could we leverage the positions that we're in and the people that God puts around us for the purposes that should be in our heart? I think God is waiting for his church to move. I don't know about you, but for me, it's like the little things in life that are going to push me over the edge, right? Like I've shared this in a sermon before, like my family could like rob the next door neighbors, and I'd be like, oh, it's no big deal. Right? The next door neighbors are going to be here this morning, so maybe I shouldn't use that illustration. But like they leave the cupboard door open in the kitchen, I want to kill them, right? It's the little things. And I'll tell you what my biggest one is. Maybe this is it for you too. Full confession this morning. I can't handle it if you're in front of me and the light turns green and you don't go. Like, I just can't. Like, I've been waiting for this light. I don't know why you didn't see this light. You're in front of me. Either go or get out of the road, right? And we all do that. Some of you are resonating with me like never before this morning, right? And we're like, come on, dude. Like, it doesn't get any greater. My go-to saying, if you're in my car, my kids know this, my go-to is, green means go. Like, I'll just say it all. If you're in front of me and the light turns green within like 3 seconds, I'll be like, green means go. Green means go. And if you don't move, like I want to drive over the top of your car, all right? That's right. And sometimes I wonder, like, is God in the same boat? Like, sometimes I wonder if God ever feels like his mission is just sitting behind his church in line and the light turns green and we don't go. Like, sometimes I just wonder if God has this mission of us making disciples, reaching people who don't know him. I wonder sometimes if God says, I've got this big truck of mission, And the light is green, and the church is just sitting there. I think God sometimes looks at us and wants to go, church, green means go. And you and I have to decide, will we step into that opportunity? So Nehemiah does. Like Nehemiah doesn't just step into the opportunity, he puts the pedal to the metal and flies through the light. So the king says he can go. And Nehemiah in verse 6, he says, and then the king said to me, with the queen sitting beside him, he said, how long will you be gone, and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him the time. And so then Nehemiah sees this green light and goes, why not? And Nehemiah said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me, to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they'll let me pass through safely until I come to Judah. And let a letter be given to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber and make the beams of the gates and the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I'm going to live in. And the king granted what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. See, church, I think there's a foundational question that we probably should have started with. Like, I think it's important for us to think about what burdens us. Are we really burdened by the things of God, and are we looking for the door to be opened? And I think we have to genuinely consider, would we actually walk through the door if God opened it? But I think the foundational question is, are we asking big enough things? Do we really trust God? I think we undershoot the generosity of God all the time. I think we constantly underestimate what God really wants to do and what God will provide if we just trust that he will move. Nehemiah goes for the whole enchilada. It's like the king cracks the door and Nehemiah goes, well, the door's open. Here we go, right? Like, this is literally what Nehemiah essentially does. He essentially asks for over a year of paid time off. Like, he went to his boss and said, hey, can I have the next year, year and a half off, but I'd still like to get paid. And then he says, oh, by the way, could you make sure nobody hurts me on my travels to this place far away from you? And the king actually sends part of the army with him. And then Nehemiah says, oh, and also, if it's not too much trouble, could you pay for all the supplies to rebuild the city that you don't care about so that we can rebuild the places of God that you don't worship? And then he goes, oh, by the way, did you catch that, how he threw that in at the end? That was real good. He said, oh, and some of that will be used for the house I build for me. And the king goes, yeah, why not? And we were reading this a couple weeks ago up in Vermilion at our campus ministry up there, and one of the girls that came, she just asked, I go, any questions? And the one girl goes, why would the king do this? She's like, he had no reason to be this generous. Why I have been way undershooting how generous people will be. And I said, well, if you don't know the answer to something, go back to the scripture, right? And Nehemiah says right at the end why the king did it. It had nothing to do with the king. He says, the king granted my request because the good hand of our God was with us. Which means the question is, do we trust that God will go with us? Do we trust that God will walk through the door that he opens with us for the things that burden his heart? Do we believe in his promise? Right? Nehemiah believed that God would do what he said he would do. And so he asked God to do things that were bigger than himself. Jesus said in Matthew 7, he told us, he said, ask and it'll be given to you. Seek and you'll find. Knock and the door will be open. Everyone who asks receives. Everyone who seeks finds, and everyone who knocks, it's opened. Church, it seems to me that the problem isn't that God doesn't provide. It seems to me the problem is we don't ask. The problem doesn't seem to be God opening the door for his purposes to be accomplished. The problem seems to be that we don't knock. The problem doesn't seem to be God not providing what we need to be the people that he calls us to be. The problem seems to be that we don't seek it. So the question is, will we ask big things of God? And will we trust that he will provide? Church, one of my favorite things about my job in campus ministry and now overseeing all of our campus ministries, I'd love for you to come over and eat some breakfast with us after second service and hear more stories about CSF. But one of the things I love is that I have gotten to see God knock down doors like that I never imagined. And I could spend the next 5 hours telling you stories, but I'm just constantly reminded of how God is just waiting for his people. This week, I had lunch with a girl named Ella in our Kearney campus ministry, and Ella is a rock star. I felt like a car salesman. I was like, Ella, what do I got to do to put you into a job with CSF today, right? And I'm trying really hard to hire her, and because she's just so good at what she does and so on fire for Jesus. And she was on our camp team this summer, and so we had lunch this week down in Kearney, and we got to talking, and we were talking about ministry, and she's a junior, and I said, well, Ella, if you didn't come work for us, which would be insane, what would you do? And I knew that Ella was a special education major and that her degree would be in teaching special ed and that she has 1 year left and she'll student teach. And I knew all these things about Ella, but she began to share her heart for this with me. And she began to talk about how, she's like, honestly, Justin, I don't want to just teach. She goes, I'm willing to teach, but she goes, that's honestly not really what I want to do. And so I kept pushing. I said, well, what do you want to do? And you could tell she was like hesitant to even say this. And she goes, Justin, I just got to be honest with you. Like, I want to change the world. Like, okay. And then she began to talk about how she has a sister, which I knew, who has Down syndrome. And Ella has this heart and this burden for those people of God, for special needs people. And she says, I just see so much potential that the world doesn't see. And she says, I see how people talk and how they treat them. And she says, I just see that, like, they just don't know. Because I just want to change everybody's thoughts and what they know. She goes, it's not that they're mean people. It's not. She goes, they just don't know. And she goes, I just want to open the world's eyes to these beautiful, wonderful people and what they can do and who they are and how they can be a part of everything that we do. And she goes, I want to change the way people think about them. I want to change the way that we teach. I want to change the education system. I want to change, I want to train and raise up people in the world. And she just goes on and on. She goes, Justin, I just want to change the way the world does this. And I'll be honest, church, I literally was sitting there and go, yeah, me too. And that's not part of my life. And it was the most dynamic, humble, I want to change the world I've ever heard in my life. Where I'm just like, there wasn't an ounce of arrogance or I'm important. It was literally, it felt like Nehemiah. It was like this burden was so great that she just couldn't hold it in. And as soon as I cracked the door and said why, she went, woof. And Ella may still work for us. We talked a little bit about how if you want to change the world, change a college student because they're the ones that graduate and go out into the world. Thought that was a pretty good sales pitch. And but here's what I want to tell you, church. If she doesn't come work for us, I don't care. But I will tell you this, she will change the world. I walked out of there going, this girl, 20 years from now, we're going to look back and the world will have a different viewpoint on the value and the worth and the amazingness of special needs people. And it will be because of Ella Hansen. And church, it got me thinking, when's the last time you and I thought God could use us to change the world? I'm 45 years old. I'm sure there was a time in my life that I thought that like Ella thinks that, but I don't know, it probably was longer ago than I'd like to mention. And so, church, as the band comes to lead us this morning, I would just ask you, when's the last time you thought God could use you to change the world? Because Scripture is incredibly clear that that's exactly what God's plan is. His plan is to build something in his people, you and me, the church, so that he can rebuild, restore, and renew something in the world. The question is, do you believe that? And do you trust that God will provide what you need? Because see, here's the funny thing in Nehemiah's story. God won't miss out if Nehemiah doesn't do this. Right? Like God didn't call Nehemiah. He didn't go to Nehemiah and said, Nehemiah, I need you specifically to do this. Nehemiah remembered the promise that God had given. He remembered that God had said if they screwed up, he'd scatter them all over the world. But he said, God, don't forget, you also said that if we return to you, you would restore what once was and you would renew your people. And so God uses Nehemiah because he walked through that door. But if Nehemiah didn't walk through that door, God wasn't going to miss out. God would still have fulfilled his promise with or without Nehemiah at some point. Here's the deal. The world, God's people, they wouldn't have missed out if Nehemiah didn't walk through the door. God had already promised that he would bring them back and he would restore them. It's not the people who miss out. The same is true for us. It's not God who misses out if you and I don't walk through the door. It's not like God's sitting up there and he has this burden that he wants addressed and he goes, well, we were going to do it, but Justin's not in, so we better wait. Like, that's not how God works, right? He's not just waiting for me to step through the door so that we can finally get it right. And it's not the people who will miss out. God has already promised that Jesus will come back and he will set all things right. He will restore all of creation. He will take all who follow him to be with him, and he will set everything right. That's already promised. We will not miss out a single thing if you don't step through the door. So that only leaves one person who misses out, and that's you and me. That's Nehemiah. Nehemiah is the one who would have missed out. He would have missed getting to be a part of God renewing, restoring, and rebuilding not just a city, but a people. Church, it's you and I that will miss out. We will miss getting to be a part of rebuilding and restoring and renewing the world as God intended it to be, the people as God intended us to be. We're the ones that miss out on getting to be a part of that. Because Jesus will fulfill his promise with or without us. And so we have to walk through the door when God opens it. We have to seize that moment. Otherwise, we will miss out on something ridiculously great that God wants to do through us and in us. And he'll go do it in and through somebody else. Church, the light is green. It's as green as it's ever been for you and me. And green means go.